This short video will introduce you to Modern Language Association style guidelines when writing a works cited page, with a focus on writing about literature. Each discipline has its own citation style. There's the APA style for the social sciences, the CSE style for biology, ecology, and medicine, and the Chicago style for art, history, music, and theater. But we'll be focusing on MLA style guidelines because you'll be writing for the English language and literature courses. It's also used for foreign languages, philosophy, and other areas in the humanities. Knowing how to use a citation style is essential, first and foremost for establishing your credibility as a researcher and a writer. Incorrect citation of sources indicates your incompetence as both within your discipline. You also provide a consistent method when you cite correctly for your readers so that they can locate your sources, making it easier to be persuaded by your ideas. And lastly, you avoid plagiarism when you know how to cite correctly. Plagiarism is an indicator of dishonesty as well as incompetence. So let's begin with the works cited page. It's the page we want to start with because it's the page that you're going to be pointing your reader to throughout your entire essay. In fact, the whole point of Modern Language Association style is to direct your reader to your works cited page, which lists the sources of all the information that you cite in your essay. Since you'll be continually pointing your reader to this page as you write your essay, it's good to have the page written beforehand. So we're going to begin with the works cited page. MLA Style Guidelines, edition 9, lists 9 elements that are common to most works: author, style, and so on. And it lists these elements in this order, and you're going to need to follow this order when listing those same elements of your sources. So let's look at an example of how this works. Okay, so we have an author, let's say Alexander Pope. You've read his mock epic poem, The Rape of the Lock, so that would be the title of the source. You found it in the Norton Anthology of English Literature, the restoration in the 18th century, so we list that as the title of the container. It was edited by Stephen Greenblatt and a bunch of other people, too many to list, so we use the abbreviation et al., which means and others. When a source has 3 or more contributors in the same role, and by the way, this same rule applies to authors. When you have 3 or more authors, you do the same thing. You list the name of the first, and then you follow it with the abbreviation et al. We found this in the 9th edition of the Norton Anthology, Volume C. The publisher, of course, is Norton and Company. It was published in 2012, and we found this poem on pages 2682 through 2704. Now, these are the 9 elements of this particular source, and we're going to list them in this order when we put them in a works cited entry. So notice it'll look something like this with a hanging indent. A hanging indent is when the first line of the entry appears at the margin on the left, but all the other lines for that entry are indented. Well, the first element is here, Alexander Pope, followed by the second, the third, the fourth, fifth, and so on. Notice that we list them in sequential order in our works cited entry. Let's look at another example. Beowulf. Well, Beowulf doesn't have an identified author, so what do? Well, we just skip element number 1. What we don't do is we don't put the word anonymous for the author. That is unacceptable in MLA style guidelines. Never use the word anonymous when you don't have the name of the author. Just skip that element. So Beowulf is the name of the source, and again we find it in a container, this time the Norton Anthology of English Literature, the Middle Ages. Again we have Stephen Greenblatt and a bunch of other people who have edited it, but notice that we also have to include another contributor, and that is its translator. This poem was translated. It was originally written in Old English. We didn't read it in Old English, so it was translated for us by Seamus Heaney. We need to list him as well, so we put translated by Seamus Heaney, comma, and then we list the editors after his name. 9th edition, Volume A, publisher Norton and Company, publication date again, and the page numbers where that poem is located. Notice that we now have these all in sequential order, and we're going to include them in sequential order in our works cited entry so that they appear just as they did in those 9 elements that we had listed before. So this is how your entry would appear in your works cited page. One last example, we have an author, Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Let's say we read her short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, found it in another anthology, Literature and Introduction to Reading and Writing. This time it was edited by 2 editors. We'll list both of their names here, Edgar V. Roberts and Robert Zvig. Remember, with 1 or 2 editors, we list their names. However, if we have 3 or more, then we list only the first, followed by the abbreviation ETAL, as we saw in the previous example. Okay, this source appears in a backpack edition of this anthology, and we don't have a number, so we skip. Again, whenever we don't have one of these elements, we simply skip to the following element. So because we don't have a number, we just go to the next element, which is the publisher, Pearson, the publication date, and then the page numbers where this appears. And we put them all in sequential order, once again listing them the way we listed them on the elements page, and put them in hanging indent format so that they appear in our Works Cited page that looks something like this. We list our sources in alphabetical order. I've circled the words the Bible here. That's because it's not alphabetized by the word the. If it were, it would appear much further down on our Works Cited list. Instead, we alphabetize it by the word Bible. Well, that's because we ignore the words the, a, and an when we are alphabetizing sources. We don't pay attention to those determiners. So because I'm ignoring the word the, I'm going to go right to the next word, which is Bible, and I'm going to alphabetize this under BI for Bible, following BE for Beowulf. Also notice that when I have 2 works by the same author, as we have down here at the bottom by Shakespeare, the second time we list the author, we don't put the author's name. Instead, in place of the author's name, we type in 3 hyphens, as we've done here. Notice, though, I have still included his sources in alphabetical order. So the Merchant of Venice appears before Much Ado About Nothing. That's because, again, we ignore the word the, and we look at the word merchant, and merchant comes before much. M-E appears before M-U alphabetically. Okay, we're going to double space throughout. Notice that there are no extra spaces between the words Works Cited, which are centered at the top of your page, and the first entry. We don't put any extra spaces there. We don't bold or increase the font size of the words Works Cited. Everything's in the same font size. Everything's listed alphabetically, and everything is double spaced throughout with no extra spaces. We use 1-inch margins around our page, and we use these hanging indents. Again, as a reminder, that means that the first line of each entry appears at the left margin, but all other lines for each entry are indented, as you can see here. Okay, and you want to list your URLs. The URLs are required unless your instructor tells you not to include them. And lastly, remember to put a page break before your Works Cited page. It needs to be on its own page, not halfway down the last page of your written essay. Okay, so sometimes the author is a corporation or an organization, as we see here, the National Endowment for the Arts. Obviously, this is not a person, but it is the author of Reading at Risk, a survey of literary reading in America. Also, sometimes the title of the source is the first element listed. We've already talked about this with Beowulf, where we didn't have an author, but sometimes television shows or films are listed without, obviously, an author. So here we have the one where everybody finds out, an episode from Friends. There's no author, so of course we just list the source, the title of the show first. All right, sometimes we need a second container. Sometimes our source flows over into another container because we are finding the source in a library database, which will be the case for most of you. So let's pick an author, Anne Goldman. The title of her article is Questions of Transport, Reading Primo Levi, Reading Dante. We found it in the Georgia Review, a periodical. We didn't have any contributors, we didn't have any versions, so we skipped down to the volume and number of the periodical, volume 64, number 1. Again, no publishers, so we go down to the date, 2010, and it appears on pages 69 through 88. The problem is we didn't pick this up as a hard copy magazine from some library shelf or some newsstand somewhere. No, we found it in a database. So we have to say where this was all found, and so we need a second container. So we found it in JSTOR, right? And then we're going to skip these other elements and go down to the location, which is the URL. So this is what we have here. We have one container which lists the actual source, and then we flow over to a second container listing the database where we found that source. So again, we're going to put all these together. This time I'm going to put an extra space between the second and the third line, just so I can show you how these are put in the correct order. For the first container, again in sequential order, 1, 2, 3, we skip elements 4 and 5 because they don't exist. 6, we skip elements 7, 8, and 9. That's from our first container. Then we go to our second container, element 3 and element 9. So this is how this would appear in your Works Cited page using both containers because you're citing a source from a database. When you're looking at databases, we need to distinguish between URLs and DOIs. The location of an online work is commonly indicated by its URL or web address. Your instructor may prefer that you not include them, but MLA recommends the inclusion of URLs in the Works Cited list. When giving a URL, you can usually omit the HTTP or the HTTPS. And so, for example, here's a source listed from JSTOR, and we do not list the HTTP before the www.jstor in its location. However, we do include the HTTPS with DOIs. A DOI is a digital object identifier. It's permanently assigned to a source by the publisher. DOIs are more reliable than URLs because DOIs remain attached to their sources even if the URL changes. Think of it as a kind of ISBN number for online sources. When one exists, a DOI is always preferred over a URL for a Works Cited entry. So here we have the DOI, and notice that for the DOI, we in fact do use an HTTPS before it. Lastly, let's talk about an optional element, date accessed. The date you access electronic material is not required because many electronic academic resources, such as those you find in the library's databases, are stable. For example, articles available in JSTOR are unlikely to change from one day to the next in its location. However, these databases, in particular JSTOR, have still been adding this optional element to their citation information. And so here we have an example here, an entry by Rex Martin, and we have an accessed date added to it. This is provided by JSTOR when you click on its Cite button, but we don't need it. It's simply not required. However, there are some online sources that can and do change. Web pages can be updated or taken down, blog posts can be modified or deleted, and some scholarly resources can move or have multiple versions, particularly those that are hosted by universities on their web pages. So there's a good reason to use this optional element for these instances. Follow the instructions that your professors give you about including this and any other optional MLA elements in your Works Cited entries. Well, that concludes our short instructional video on using MLA style guidelines to create a Works Cited page.